incredible people on this panel who come to this question of ethics. How do we teach ethics? How do we cook using an ethical framework? How we make decisions and the research around farmer decision-making, consumer decision-making, how we live as farmers, how we ranch. And I don't think we're going to have any clear answers here, but I think we're going to have a really robust conversation. So to begin with, panelists, I have the same question for all of you, and then I have individual questions for each of you too. So as you all are going to the grocery store, or not, choosing food to consume for yourselves and your family or your loved ones, what do you look for? What is ethical food in your mind? What is ethical consumption? And I'm sorry, this is a personal question, this is a hard question, but you signed up for this panel. So do the best you can, and I think it's okay. There is no perfect system. I think that is quite clear. But I think all of our perspectives are really important. So we'll start with you.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Matt, for inviting us here and for convening this, what so far I think has been an absolutely really engaging conversation over the past couple of days, and thank you all for being here. It's such a tough question, and this is a question I engage with my students kind of constantly, this dilemma of what do we consume, and students come to me from all over the country and say, I just want to know what to buy. Just tell me the answer. Just what label is the right label? And I end up saying, I'm sorry, there is no label, there is no answer, there is no system. And I've heard many of us over the past couple of days saying, we live within this broken food system, and I want to kind of reframe that to say that the food system we live in is not broken, it's designed to be based on exploitation and extraction of humans, animals, and the planet. And so when we live within this system and we're all participating, we're all complicit because we're all eating, we have to acknowledge that that is the foundation of what we get to choose from. And this, of course, was set up well before any of us were making these decisions, and we've inherited it as a system, right? So the choices we can make all come with that caveat. Even when we're producing things ourselves, which is the best possible option and a privilege that many of us have, we still have ethical questions, dilemmas, decisions. What went into that, row of corn that I planted, and, the plastic irrigation pipe that I used, that was produced from fossil fuel, et cetera. There just is, as you said, no perfect system. So I appreciate that question. And for me, the choices come down to knowing the source as best as I possibly can, and frankly I limit my diet relatively severely in terms of what I decide to purchase for that ethical reason. It's tricky because I have children your age, and I have a son who eats only 3 things. 2 of them are white and don't come from our farm. It's just such a complex dilemma, But I really try to eat seasonally as much as I can. I try to support. I try to frame the question for my students and also for myself as, where will my purchase have the most impact when I have to purchase something, and where will it be negligible or contributing, to the perpetuation of the negative situation we live in, and wherever I can support a farmer who I know is doing something well, that's what I choose to do. I don't know if I can answer it more clearly than that.
So I would say that I now find this to be a much more complex question than I would have 20 years ago when I started working on this, because I have thought about this a lot, tried all different kinds of approaches to getting towards a more and more ethical and health-sustaining and planet-sustaining diet, and yet, I buy pasta and salt and tea and, stuff from all over the world, and I increasingly realize, especially when I look at my pantry, not so much in my fridge or on my counters for the perishable stuff, but the stuff in the pantry, it's like from all over the world, spices and all this stuff. And so one of the things I try to encourage people when they're thinking about this question is to just not be paralyzed, to sort of do the best you can, make good choices to, in the ways that you are able financially and in terms of what your body requires. I think that's a really important thing. And I also, every time I'm at a sort of a conference or other venue where these things are being talked about, I think about the question of joy and pleasure, because I actually believe that eating and food is one of the greatest sources of human pleasure and joy. And when we talk so much about the ethical and environmental considerations, which unfortunately most Americans are still not thinking that much about, so the challenge is getting everyone to think about it. But for probably most people in this room, we're all really intensely grappling with it every day, probably. And so I'm always sort of thinking, in this room, I want to urge we don't forget about joy and pleasure and what tastes good. And in fact, I've already mentioned this book to a couple people today in conversation. The book that's really almost flipping my whole head on this whole question is the book Nourishment by Dr. Fred Provenza, which I'm now reading for the second time. Which is, I think some of you in the room have read it. I know, I've talked with some of you about it on Facebook. But he talks deeply and extensively about scientific research and lots of anecdotal information and so forth about our inherent nutritional wisdom and what each of us contains about what our bodies need, which varies from day to day, from year to year, according to your life history, according to your gender, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we always have to keep in mind how important individuality is in all of this. So I don't shop that much at the supermarket. I do get pasta and salt and all that, but I try to get the meat in our household is almost exclusively the meat that we raise ourselves, which frustrates our children because we don't raise pigs, so they don't get to work very often. We get our eggs from a neighbor. We raise our own turkey and cattle, so our beef and turkey comes from us. And we have an orchard and a garden, and so I try to raise a lot of food, and we also have several wonderful local farmers. So I get a lot of our produce from our neighbors and ourselves. But increasingly, I don't get too tied up in knots about where each individual ingredient comes from. I just try to do the best I can for what I think our family and I individually require nutritionally, and to have a delicious, joy-providing meal.
I love that. Glad. So joy and pleasure.
Yeah.
And I think what ends up mostly at my table is gratitude. I think that's the operative at my little dinky old farm. And I'll raise a few pigs and have eggs and everything I need out of the garden, and then chase down some, there's an old farmer down the road from me who used to be a dairyman and will raise beef cows and let them get old, nice and fat, and, a year or two older than most people do. And last winter I went to his house, which looks even more tumble down than my place. In fact, when I bought my place and I ran into him and I knew him already, I said, "David, I'm living up the road from you now." And he said, "Really? Where?" And I said, "Well, I bought Rena Darling's old farm." And he said, "You mean that dilapidated old place?" I said, "Yes." So his place is, we're in the same, we're kind of in the same antique of old houses anyway. So I went into his house with a basket and a big furniture clamp, because he's been someone who's been kind of taken advantage of in his simple, honest way. So I clamped this basket to, scales. I clamped the scales to a doorway in his house, and then fought my way through the stuff to the back room where there was a freezer, and hauled out of it a bunch of meat, and would hold up a piece and say, "David, can you want to part with this?" And he only has a single tooth in his head, so he really wasn't married to keeping, the steaks and the roast, because he can't really. So I go through the whole thing with him, how much and which piece, and then I went through the whole thing again, and I took it home, and so when I get home with, and what ends up at my table are the stories of David and the you know, Eleanor Freeman as dairy woman mother, and their windswept old 650-acre farm, and, you know, kindly old David just sitting up there by himself, you know, reflecting on his life. So I guess I pay a lot less attention to, I certainly don't pay any attention to any kind of scientific breakdown about what I should eat. Rather, I just, whatever comes along, I try to keep it really simple, just to remember what it took to make it, and feel full, feel nourished.
This actually is working? Okay, it is, yeah. Okay, it's hard to follow these string of eloquent, articulate answers here. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those questions I feel like my first thought I had was, well, what do I do? And then the second question myself is, what do I want to tell you that I do? How different are those answers? I mean, reflecting a bit on what's been said before, I don't know, I mean, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of like how I was brought up in terms of the food that was served to me and how I think that affects me. I don't think I was brought up in a particularly strong culinary culture. And I think that still does affect my eating habits and the choices that I make. I do think it helps for me. So I study human behavior, and I study how humans use cues and heuristics to make decisions, and it turns out I'm a human and do that same stuff. So I look at the organic valley thing, it makes me feel good, and so I get that. I feel like, all right, today's gotten a little better, whatever else happened today. And keeping it simple, I do think, I see this in a lot of students too, we get kind of, someone said it earlier, we get kind of stuck in this, well, we need to find the solution to everything or be perfect or whatever, or what's the point? And I felt like in the video there was, one of the people in the video said, well, I'm not a purist, I'm kind of just trying to find what works or something like that. And so I do feel like I think you can get stuck in this, well, if I can't kind of solve everything by the time I'm 22 before I get my bachelor's, then just what's the point? And I was remembering a talk I actually heard from this fellow named Amartya Sen, who you all might have heard about. He said, we should stop thinking about comparing what we're doing with some idealized reality that's never going to quite get here, and more think about, like, what can we do just a little bit better, like today? And I think that's actually really important. And basically for my own life, I try to keep it simple, just because sometimes by the time I get to the grocery store, I'm pretty tired and the lights are fluorescent above me and I'm not feeling too hot. So I get, eggs and pasta and basic things, and then I'm on my way. I mean, at the end of the day, it's maybe not that interesting an answer of what I actually do there. But that was the thoughts I had when you asked the question.
Thank you. Well, certainly I think a great deal about the ethics of food, since I own a restaurant with Manifesto. And there are many ways I could approach the question, which wasn't the question asked, but the question of why Vinland exists, why I decided to open this restaurant 6 years ago that's committed to using all local ingredients, and really getting back to a point that was made by the gentleman sitting behind me during the last session. He mentioned the word collapse. The fact that we live on a finite planet, finite resources. We've had a global population that has largely been growing for 10,000 years, has been growing exponentially for the past century. And so I think if we're going to talk about the ethics of food, we can't think about it without considering the ways in which we're already in the midst of collapse, and the ways that collapse can and may and will continue to unfold in our lifetimes and beyond. So when I think about the reasons why I opened Vinland, to me at least, if not necessarily what I'm putting out to my guests on any kind of regular basis, to me, building resiliency in the local food system is the number one reason, because I think it's ultimately saving lives. I think the more that we are dependent upon a monolithic, highly industrialized, highly fossil fuel intensive industrial food system, where food is traveling a huge number of miles. And I mean, I look at Maine. Maine has amazing local food, and yet the food in Maine is traveling more miles than any other state in the union. It shouldn't be that way, but it is that way right now. The more that we can start building resiliency in the other direction, the more we can actually save lives, the more that we can transmit humanity and our culture, the positive elements of our culture, into the future. So I think that's really the essence of the ethical question. Now, in terms of what we should eat, what we're going to choose to spend our money on, what we're going to choose to use our hours and our bodies in work to produce, I don't think there's any one formula that works for everyone and works in every ecosystem, works in every community. I definitely think there are some dead ends, and I would definitely name veganism as number one. But I do think that it's important to know that there's no free lunch. All food has consequence, all choices in life have consequence. You're never going to know all the consequences. So you're not committing yourself to figuring out what are all the consequences. You're committing yourself to being mindful about the fact that there are consequences, and being humble in the face of the reality that you're never going to know all of those consequences. So you might think, well, it's important to calculate the food miles, but of course, is it as the crow flies? Is it road miles, or have road miles compared to rail miles, or to sea miles? Sure, it feels nice to eat that fresh lettuce from California in the wintertime, but that to be transported quickly under refrigeration. If you're eating California olive oil, not only is that far, far, far more calorie intensive, it didn't need to be transported under refrigeration. So you got almost no nourishment out of the lettuce. You can get tremendous nourishment out of olive oil that took up less space in a truck or on a train. But there are always more things to think about than we can possibly think of. So I think humility is absolutely essential. I just want to cast my vote. Really, the most important things were already said. So I'm just going to cast my vote. And as Thoreau says, in life we need to cast our whole vote. Not just at the ballot box. Every choice that we make, because it has consequences, is a vote. So I'm going to cast my votes in favor of gratitude. I think that's of the utmost importance. When we are grateful for the food on our plates, the food that will fuel our bodies, we're not just going to shovel it into the garbage. We're not going to alienate ourselves from the people who produced it, from the lives of the animals and the plants that we're actually consuming, or are part of an ecosystem from which our food came. And I think what Nicolette said about joy, this is, I think about how a poll was done asking what's the first word that you associate with chocolate cake, and American respondents responded with guilt. And French respondents answered with celebration as the number one response. So I think that actually says a little something about why the French have a healthier relationship with food and their bodies. So there's a whole lot more that we all have to say, I'm sure. So I'm going to stop there.
Okay, thank you all for those thoughtful responses. To change the framing of this a little bit, thinking about sort of the framework for what is ethical in agriculture and in consumption. Nicolette, I wanted to ask you a question. So I've heard you talk about slaughtering animals, eating animals as an ethical choice because it is done by so many individuals worldwide and in this country. So I wonder, given that beef production is what it is, the vast majority being raised in confinement and on very scaled operations, I wonder, do you think that there is an acceptance of how beef is raised presently, how animals, livestock are raised presently, and does that somehow mean that it is ethical? Is it defensible?
Well, I've written 2 books, and my first book was actually called Righteous Pork Chop, and it was broadly looking at all the species. And when I wrote the Defending Beef book, I sort of built on what I said in the first book, because in the Righteous Pork Chop book, I went and talked about each individual species and how they're raised today, and argued, broadly speaking, that there are serious ethical problems with the way we're raising animals today. But when I was writing the beef chapter, I realized it was almost a defense of the way, the beef cattle are raised, because it was so much better than all of the other species in terms of the conventional standard, Western methods in the United States today that prevail. So I would start out by saying that I feel like that there's this unnecessary negative attention with respect to beef for 2 reasons. First of all, because of this ethical consideration about the individual life of the animal, and because most beef cattle all over the world, but including in the United States, spend most of their lives on grass, and basically living a fairly natural existence. Even the animals that end up going to feedlots spend the first year with their mothers and in a herd and grazing, and then usually less than a year in a feedlot, which is a more crowded setting, but it's still an outdoor environment. And I've been to a lot of feedlots, and quite honestly, I didn't find them that troubling. In contrast to that, I've been to hog confinement operations, and it was really hard to even be in there. They were very troubling places, I thought, especially for the sows. So I would say, first of all, I'm not that troubled by the way beef, particularly beef, are raised. But I think, in my book, Defending Beef, I make a whole argument for what needs to be done better. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And really, with respect to the whole question of beef, I feel like we've missed, not we, but the greater conversation that's out there has missed the whole potential for beef to be a force for good. And Seth, who's standing in the back, and Carl is sitting over there, they're making this argument all the time with their Soil for Climate group. And the world was covered with grazing animals for tens of millions of years. Most of those animals are gone now. About 99% of the wild animals that were once on the planet are gone. And so I argue in Defending Beef, and I think this argument is made really credibly by a lot of people, especially Alan Savory, the wildlife ecologist Alan Savory, is that we have to have those grazing animals. We must have them for proper ecosystem function for the globe. So the question is not whether we should get rid of the animals, it's about how we raise them. So I always love the little phrase, it's not the cow, it's the how. And I do believe that the way we are raising all animals in this country, including beef cattle, could be done better. But there's the question of the life of the animal in terms of the ethic, and there's the question of the death. And I think that both aspects of those need to be done. I feel a very high ethical obligation to the animals in our food system, and that we're not living up to that, broadly speaking, in most, agricultural operations in the United States today. So I feel there's a lot of work to be done. But that's a whole separate question from whether or not it's ethical to raise animals for food and to slaughter them. And I also feel that the slaughtering should be done to the highest possible standards. I write about this in both of my books, what I think is required for ethical slaughter of animals. But I think that the animals are an essential part of the Earth's ecosystems and therefore our food systems. And the book I'm working on right now is about omnivory. And I am increasingly persuaded that the food we get from animals are an incredibly important part of human nourishment. and that we really ignore the fact that we are biologically omnivores at our peril. And that's the book I'm writing now.
Thank you. So Suzanne, I love your writing in the Small Farmers Journal, and if you haven't read Suzanne's writing in the Small Farmers Journal, you should, because it is just like talking to so many farmers, honestly. You just write with such clarity and just, I don't know, frankness about the life of a farmer that is so beautiful. But there's one quote in there from an article I was looking at, and it says, starting in with a dairy cow is a life-changing event like getting married and having children all at once. So I wonder, from an ethical standpoint, how do you navigate a relationship with an animal? And what sort of guides your sense of right or wrong as you raise livestock?
Well, it's just me on the farm, so I don't have a family, and I generally don't have anybody to talk to besides my draft horses and my cat and my few chickens. So, the tough part about that is you want to share what wonders you discover in the day, you know, what you harvested or what you saw. But what it's done for me is it's really narrowed down my daily interactions with what I perceive to be Mother Nature herself. So I try to follow her guidance as I perceive it, and again, because there's a lack of humans in my immediate world, then I end up spending a lot of time with my animals. I don't have a dairy cow right now. I have this team of draft horses that I grow vegetables with, but I adore cows, and you just end up with certain sensitivities to their needs and certain ways to read their needs. You know, I remember when I first had dairy cows, and they would have their calves, and I learned to hear when the calf was bleeding for, I could tell whether it was for hay or for water. And I thought, well, this is good. I'm learning to really hear them, you know. I think that there's so much to learn from them that I don't feel like I'm anthropomorphizing at all. I feel like finding a way to reach into the millennia of interdependency between animals and people, and I always seem to see all that almost on a daily basis. So my goal is always to read the animals' needs and to maintain the dynamic that we're working together, whether it's a cow or a pig or horses at work, rather than me, forcing my schedule or some kind of abstract goal. I always feel that whatever it is that we get out of a day or a minute or a year is what we do together. So one of my favorite photographs is a picture in an old French dairying book of it's two old hags like me in their crappy old house, and there's this big window in their stone house somewhere, and it's open, and they're husking corn or something in their house, and the cows, who are presumably in a stall in the next, behind that window, they're sticking their heads into the kitchen, you know, they're gonna get something, and I just thought, wow, what a perfect house, you know? You don't have to walk around to the barn. each other's company, you know? I mean, learning to just be with, my goal has always been never, ever disappoint an animal, never, especially a young animal. So the calves, you know, are like figuring out the harmonious way to wean them, also, you know, with respect to their social structure, you know, not in a convoluted, non-man person, modern way of, you know, silliness, but in a way of saying, okay, so, all right, so if we just leave the two mothers in their stanchions tonight and tie the little heifers in between them so they can still get the lick on the head and the bedtime story, we'll find out, you know, how very important that milk was anyway. And then when it's time for those cows to go out, get two other cows to come in and keep them company, you know. I remember once winning a little bull calf at a farmer's market raffle, you know, right? Bringing it home and plunking it down, you know, a cow from a dairy, had never met his mother, you know, which to me is just like, no. Put this calf down in a straw bedded pack with all the mother cows. I mean, a cow is more maternal than we are. And I think we've lost our maternity from drinking milk from sad cows who never met their babies personally. All these mother cows came in and they all said, "Who are you, darling?" You know, just like all the old aunts come in and lick it and you know, attend to it. And so I recognize and respect the dignity of all the beings, and don't worry too much about efficiency or the, you know, what, spreadsheet or something.
I don't want to follow.
You are. Unfortunately, you are next. So, Michael, you study the commons, agriculture, decision-making by fishers, as fisher people, fishermen and women, and farmers in growing their crops. So I have a couple of questions therein. Number one, where do you see farmers construct or understand a sense of the commons in their work? And what influences, or what are the biggest influences that you found in terms of how farmers make decisions, in terms of how they interact with the commons?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so in the context of the work I've done with farmers, it's mostly been in northern New Mexico, Colorado, and also in the Dominican Republic. And that work was motivated by the fact that all these farmers relied on, they were all irrigating farmers. So in the DR, they're irrigating rice paddies there, like acres and acres and acres of just monoculture rice. In northern New Mexico, there's these systems called the acequias, which are actually, you know, their ancestors were the Spaniards and Native Americans that were there. And the Spaniards came along in 1600. There are acequias in Spain that come from the Moorish area, and so there's just this like deep history in those systems as well. And they really are like their own group of folks. And so the commons, right, these shared resources that are really a source of a lot of our, I mean, the commons is about interdependence, right? So a commons is a shared resource so that if I take something, it's less available for someone else, or it's a resource that we produce together, right? Like common understanding and knowledge, like those are all commons. And they all imply that what one of us does affects everyone else. And that's when we need to have a lot of important and sometimes difficult conversations about what to do, because I can't just do whatever I want. If I'm sharing a resource, if I'm helping try to produce it with someone else. So, I mean, the main commons that I've worked with have been water resources. So in the western US, it's about surface water. These are snowmelt dependent systems, but it's also groundwater. Groundwater is a huge commons problem. It's much less visible, and so local folks, it's a much larger struggle to actually get a handle on where our resource is going. I know that I'm spending more money on my pumping. I know that I have to dig my well farther, but like I don't really, I can't see it disappearing. So, you know, it's both a challenge and an opportunity. The places where the farmers have this interdependence, it can kind of go one way or the other. They can not work together and kind of lead to what we call the tragedy commons, where everyone kind of suffers because you're taking too much of it. So in you know, the case in southern Colorado, the San Luis Valley, which maybe people know, it was dependent on snow melt driven surface water supplies from like the San Cristo and basically the Colorado Rockies. In the 1950s, instead of getting together and acting collectively, what the farmers did initially was they just said, okay, we're going to just tap the groundwater, and that's what they did. And so you could say that that's a resilient strategy, because now they have two sources of water. They have the surface water and they have the groundwater. I mean, I think the problem with that was that they were kind of punting on a more difficult political question, which is how would we all get together to resolve this commons management problem, so that, you know, in 2010 there was another drought and it turns out they had just been annihilating their groundwater. And it's interesting because in my field, I study community-based natural resource management. And so there's a big discourse in the field about how we can't rely on top-down governance to kind of come in and solve everyone's problems. That's important, but we also need to think about how people can kind of act collectively from the bottom up and solve their problems based on their own context, etc. It's a big part of our discourse. So whenever I go to a new system, I'm ready to appreciate local knowledge and all of these things. But it was interesting in that case, the farmers had just really been struggling, and what helped them was actually that the state of Colorado did several things. One is that they produced data on just how bad the aquifer was doing. And so like the farmers went to this meeting, and this bureaucrat was like, look folks, there's this line, and it's going this way, and it means like you're just destroying all of your water resources. And that just was, there was this like awkward, honest silence initially where the farmer was like, oh shit, right? Like what are we gonna do? And so that was this case of where actually like it's not quite top down, but like scientific knowledge was actually really helpful in producing this common understanding of the interdependence among these farmers. And so since then, several of them have actually gotten together and organized this kind of groundwater district and said, no, we're gonna like actually, we're gonna cost water. Water's not gonna be free anymore. And that's actually been, so there was this idea of the state actually coming in and not telling people what to do and saying, we're gonna help you understand what your situation is and help you figure out how you wanna resolve that for yourselves. And I love that case because it gets us beyond this kind of dichotomy I feel we can fall into. There's lots of dichotomies we can fall into, but this kind of bottom up versus top down, where right, everyone like wants to have their favorite approach. Like I'm a bottom up person, right? I like markets, or I'm a top down person. I like protected areas, and aren't you a jerk if you don't agree with me? And this was a nice example of no, the state's doing some stuff here, but it's ultimately the role it's playing is in helping local folks understand and solve their own problems. And when I think about, and this one word that we have for that in academic discourse is like co-management. Like how do we get different types of folks actually working together? How can the government come in and help people as opposed to necessarily say, okay, well we know what you should be doing better than you do. How do you share these different types of knowledge? You know, other types of commons, other types of interdependencies that we've been talking about, obviously like through, I think an interdependence that I've seen farmers struggle with is that they have this dynamic where they basically face this collective action problem where, well, the one with groundwater is that they have a collective action problem. If we don't cooperate, we're just going to destroy this resource. But with the markets, they have this problem where if we all produce too much, we're going to lower the prices, and then we need to produce more, and then we're going to lower prices. And so there's this similar dynamic where you kind of need folks to kind of get together somehow and act collectively from the bottom up or aided by the top down, et cetera, and figure out how they're actually going to act in the collective interest. So that's been like, at least in my own work, like how I've seen farmers engage with each other. And I just remember one other thought I had that I didn't finish. So it's these commons challenges represent both, they are challenges and they are opportunities, right? So if you can't resolve them, then you can lead down one path that can really be hard to recover from, right? Because there's a lot of path dependence in social and ecological systems. If 5 of us try to start collaborating and one of us just proves not to be trustworthy, it'd be hard to recover from that necessarily. But there can also be opportunities to realize that you are interdependent. and that you can actually do something about that. And again, like that's what I saw was so promising about this case in southern Colorado, is that people like were able to kind of get from one path, right, where they're kind of avoiding their problems with technical solutions, and realize that no, we have this level of interdependence, so we can actually do something about it. This becomes an opportunity to build, you know, a stronger. In the last session, there was some discussion of the importance of building communities. We can build a stronger sense of community by realizing how we are independent based on a shared natural resource. So, you know, I think there's lots of examples in life where things that are challenges are also opportunities, and you can, hopefully you can head down the path of the opportunity, not the challenge. But I think the first step is realizing, you know, where those interdependencies are. Without kind of overwhelming you with this idea that there is as you were saying, like there's so many consequences of what all of us do. There's endless numbers of interdependencies. So how do we pick one or two and do something about that? But that's what I have to say.
So, David, I wanted to go to you next, thinking about local interdependencies and local solutions. Vinland is certainly an example of that, the restaurant. And I wonder, how has your approach of sourcing local, sourcing organic, do you believe that that is a local solution for some of the challenges that you've seen in your community?
Vinland is more of a workshop for a local cuisine than it is a model for how everybody should eat, or a restaurant that frankly is necessarily accessible on a regular basis to everyone. And that's something that I definitely grapple with. You know, I think creative people throughout the ages have often found themselves in an ethically dicey relationship with wealth. If I understand correctly, this was at least, as far as he was concerned, what drove Mark Rothko to kill himself. That people who accumulate enormous wealth, I would say more or less by definition on the backs of others, are also the patrons of the arts. So when one owns a fine dining restaurant, as I do, I greatly appreciate the many people who save up for a special occasion, who are there to treat themselves to something that they can't have regularly. I also recognize that a lot of the people have just a massive amount of money, and it's just no big deal to drop a lot of money on a fancy meal. Now, why do I have to charge a lot of money? Well, part of it is getting back to what Liana said before about how the food system is designed to be exploitative. So when you are swimming against the current in basically every possible way, the amount of effort that has to go into sourcing food that could even remotely be considered ethical, and to having a business that runs ethically top to bottom, where we're energy efficient, where the labor of everyone involved is being compensated fairly, where people are working in a healthy and safe environment, when you just have to prep everything absolutely from scratch. I mean, it's not even just that not buying the oil that I cook with. Rather it's, how should I say this? At Vinland, we don't use lemon because it's not a local product. We use condensed yogurt whey as the major source of acid in the food, but that means I have to get in yogurt whey. I need to cook it down by about 95%. There's a lot of labor going into just this basic ingredient that's in a lot of the food. I'm cooking with ghee all the time. It means I'm buying in this butter, this local pasture-raised butter and then processing it into ghee. So there are these steps that just wouldn't exist anywhere else. Anyhow, there are a lot of reasons why Finland is extremely labor-intensive. We cannot realistically be a cheap restaurant. So when I say it's a workshop, I think it's a place where I and whoever I have working with me can engage in a process of thinking about what does it mean to create a cuisine of place. Because I think if you look at any culture that does exist more sustainably on their land than, circa 2019 Americans do, by and large, certainly in Portland, Maine, and in most places. I think when people live more sustainably in place, it's because they identify with that place. And I think that identification really begins at the dinner table, or the breakfast table. It begins with the food, with a relationship to the food. So when you're in Tuscany, where I happen to have a lot of family and getting married next week, so that's fun. When you're in Tuscany, the assumption is you're going to be eating Tuscan food. And every now and then you might get sushi, but you're generally going to have Tuscan food at every meal. Likewise in Provence, likewise in Japan, likewise in so many parts of the world. We don't have that. In Maine, in Portland, Maine, which has become a culinary destination, the hype machine is out of control. But there's no sense at all of we're just going to eat Maine food, right? It's like, oh, we're going for French or Japanese or Italian or Indonesian or whatever it is. It's never Maine food. And it belies this tremendous lack of connection to the land. So I think that when we have a cuisine of place that arises from and exists in dynamic equilibrium with the land, with the sea, then we really take responsibility for the land. We have to. When we understand that our food comes from the land first and foremost, not from the supermarket, then our allegiances shift. And I think that that's the most important thing that we need to do right now, is shift our allegiance towards the land.
Well, that is a great segue to my question for you, Leanna. Taking responsibility for the land. I know that at the mountain school you were telling me about how that's one of the core things that you try to do, right? To have high schoolers learn to take responsibility for a place, and as the farmer and instructor there, you have a unique role in that. So I wonder, what do you think high schoolers need to know about making ethical choices when it comes to consumption, and what do you think they're missing? Where are they starting from?
That's such a great question, thank you. And David, thank you so much for that wonderful segue. I think it's so important for everyone to have a connection to the land, and that is the number one thing that our students are missing. Again, they come from all over the country, and there are a few who come from local area, rural areas, maybe not even local, sometimes, occasionally, a student who will come to us from a family of farmers. But for the most part, they're from urban environments and really don't have much of a connection to any particular place in nature that is a deep sort of soul connection, which I think is really a fundamental element to being able to understand the kind of relationship we need to develop with the environment, if we're going to care for the environment, and with our food system, if we're going to have an ethical system. It's a relationship. And so one of the things that we do well at the Mountain School, there are things that we don't do well that need work, but one of the things that I really appreciate about our institution and our system is that we set the students up to make a direct connection with the land, and the mission of the school is for a student to learn to know a place and take care of it, and then to reach beyond the self and work for the common good. And so within that framework, we have sort of a comprehensive curriculum, both within a classroom and outside the classroom, that gets students really deeply connected with the land, whether it's through their environmental science course, where they're studying a section of our forest, whether it's part of the work program where they're harvesting the firewood that we use to heat our campus, whether it is working on the farm, which they do 6 days a week to produce all of the meat that we consume, most of the eggs, all of the vegetables, a good proportion of the fruit. So we have or maple syrup, haying, we have a very significant part of our curriculum that is production oriented, as well as we also spend some time navigating the landscape in a more, I would call, recreational manner, learning orienteering skills and going on a campus solo camping trip, which is actually where the students are present, or they're heading out tomorrow, to be 4 days alone in the woods, each of them. So the point is really to get to know this place and have this deep connection with the land, which is something that they don't all come in with, and I think is a fundamental element, as I said, to them developing personal investment, or how do we get them to care, right? This is the question. And once they start to feel the connection and the love for this place and how they feel when they're connected to this place, whether it's doing manual labor or just being in the woods and observing and absorbing this amazing environment, then there's a place of connection from which we can build on the important knowledge that they need in order to make the ethical decisions about their impacts in the world. So what are they missing? That's the number one thing. And then from there, we have many conversations going in many directions about where there are disconnects in our thinking about the food system. I don't know if it makes sense to go into those now.
All right. So we have about 25 minutes left. So maybe I'll ask a couple more questions and then we'll get to audience questions. Are we?
Yep. We have about 3:30.
Oh, terrific. All right, well then I do have more questions. Excellent. So, Nicolette, I wanted to go back to you. There has been a lot of conversation about bestowing rights on Lake Erie or, with animals. And as a lawyer previously, I wonder, what is your response to that in terms of thinking about a rights-based framework for defining what is ethical when it comes to production and consumption?
Okay, so I worked as a lawyer for 10 years and I'm licensed to practice law in 3 states, but I'm not acting as a lawyer now. So I don't think about these things in legal terms very often. I don't really think that corporations should have human rights, and I don't really think that animals should have human rights either. I don't really view it that way. I really liked Matthew Scully's book, Dominion, if any of you are familiar with that. He was one of the senior speechwriters for President George W. Bush, and I got to know him a few years ago, and interestingly, you wouldn't think of George W. Bush's speechwriter being a big animal rights person, but he is. And he wrote this wonderful book called Dominion, which was all about our ethical obligation to animals. And he as a very, conservative Republican, really also is quite skeptical, and I wouldn't put myself in that political category, but he certainly is. But I sort of share his skepticism about the notion of rights when applied to non-human entities. And what he talks about it more as our obligation for mercy. And that's how he frames it. And he's a very devout Catholic as well, and so it really is, I think that springs from his own religious background. But to me, this notion of the relationship that's come up a couple times today in this conversation already, the more I've learned about farm animals and food systems, and then I was a biology major in college, and I spent a lot of time as a child outside, and I'm always amazed when people don't have a connection to place, a natural place, because that was so much a part of my childhood and my childhood experience. And now I live on a ranch, and I'm out in it every single day, And increasingly, I'm convinced that what's really problematic about the way we eat and the way we live in modern life is this disconnection from daily, deep interactions with nature. And just being, in fact, one of the things that has shocked me was, I was a biology major in college, I spent all this time outside as a kid and everything, but I hadn't thought hardly anything about fungi until the last 10 years. And when I started really delving into soil and how it works on a microscopic level, which is really the engine for the food systems and for our globe, that's when I first started realizing, my God, it's all about the mycelium. I didn't even know what a mycelium was, 15 years ago. So I've started to realize that even as someone myself who was, studying biology and living in natural environments a lot, there was so much I wasn't seeing. And when I started doing really regular foraging for wild food, but especially mushrooms, that's when I started to really see these extraordinary things happening with the fungi in our own immediate environment where I live in California, because I would go every day and I would see these tremendous changes from day to day. And if you see, I just saw on, this is one of the great things about Facebook. There are a lot of bad things about Facebook, but one of the really cool things about Facebook is seeing the little videos that people post on Facebook about nature. And there's this incredible one, a time-lapse one of different fungi that I just saw the other day, and it will just blow your mind if you haven't seen it. Just watching these things do these extraordinary, iterations and seeing it in time-lapse is really incredible. So to me, what we're lacking is not that we aren't recognizing the rights or we're not bestowing legal rights, to bring it back to the question. It's that we're not understanding, we're not paying attention, we're not listening to this natural world from which we all come and to which we all will return. And so we're just, we're just like so, even those of us living on the land are too divorced from that natural connectedness that we have with all living entities. And part of the reason I have grown so skeptical of veganism as well, I like that phrase that it's a dead end, is to me is it's so much, why does an animal deserve a different level of respect than a fungus? If you really start looking at the fungi in your environment, that you realize how absolutely essential they are and how all living systems and all living entities are connected to all other plants, fungi, and animals. And this is why I'm so troubled by this idea that we need to eat less meat as a primary message in the ecological food movement, because to me, that has nothing to do with how connected we are to good health or to the way we're designed to live or to eat. Because in fact, all natural systems contain lots of animals from the microscopic level to the macroscopic. And if we start saying, well, this needs to be cut out of our agricultural systems and our diet, we're actually moving further away from modeling our farming systems on natural systems, which is all about these relationships. So I'm all about reestablishing those connections and increasing our understanding and our observation and our listening and to living things, but I'm very skeptical of this concept of rights as the mechanism to get us there.
Great. So thinking about respect for what happens on the farm and the natural systems, farmers are, of course, part of the system of the farm. So a question I have for Suzanne and Leanna is, what, for the owner, operator, and for farm labor, how should consumers think about ethics when it comes to how the farmer is doing? We've had a lot of conversation today about, and we see in the media, and some of us know firsthand, that many farmers are struggling. Many farmers are not being paid a living wage. Many farm workers also are not being paid a living wage. So I wonder, what is your viewpoint as a farmer as to what is the optimal treatment for you in this, from a consumer standpoint? What do you think farmers deserve? Start with you, Suzanne.
What do farmers deserve? I think that's probably, has to be solved on an individual basis. In my life experience on the farm with people showing up at all hours, to either hope to get a certain thing or just to see what's going on. I'm always really, really deeply aware of how eager and hungry people are for a real experience, you know. So if somebody comes to my farm and I'm baking bread in my bread oven or something, I can sense how deeply hungry they are for that real experience, and how immediately it then is a personal it's a personal question for the visitor. You know, they finally found somebody who isn't seated at a computer, doesn't have headphones on, and might listen to them, in addition to get the best eggs or the best bread or whatever, or some bread or some eggs. So I guess for me, the thing that's in this world, I don't, you know, there's a whole lot fewer farms even on the road that I live on than there used to be. And I don't have a lot of, you know, connection with other people doing the sorts of work that I do, because it's a little bit out of the current mainstream, but you just wish that there was more camaraderie. I mean, the depths to which I feel necessary to go with what I raise and the animals, the vegetables I raise, the animals that I raise, the bread dough that I raise, and the people is reaching deep for me most of the time. And I just see such a hunger out there for a real connection, and I'm grateful to whatever extent, in addition to the 14-hour days that you do, that you can just tend that heart that comes along, you know. Seems like with the difficulties in this world on the increase, that there's just going to be more and more heart calisthenics, you know, just to be prepared to meet that moment, you know. I don't know if that really, is that?
I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach to answering this question, because I think this is an opportunity to talk about something that is sort of unappealing subject to look at a little bit, but is very real for me as a farmer, and I think for most farmers, and is something I encounter almost every day interacting with students, academics, people who don't see themselves working in the food system, and that has to do with the stigma of being a farmer. Being a farmer isn't something that many of my students imagine themselves doing as any kind of a palatable career. I don't suppose that their parents, who are paying $30,000 for them to attend school for 4 months, would imagine them going into farming as a desirable profession. And the fact that I identify myself as a farmer immediately creates a barrier because of the social stigma of being a person who has chosen an agricultural life. And that, I think, has very deep roots in a long history that we don't have time to explore, perhaps today. But the fact is that as long as farmers are seen as the simple people, the ones who haven't managed to make it on Wall Street or couldn't figure out another career, the non-intellectuals, or those who are, just whatever other classifications farmers seem to be receiving as general assumptions within society. there's going to be difficulty in terms of the kinds of respect and acknowledgement that farmers and farm laborers alike deserve to receive. And I think it's a problem because we need more people going into agriculture. We need more farmers, we need more young people having this connection with land and going into production and creating resilient systems. And it's a barrier for me to try and cross with my students to imagine how to present to them the fulfillment that I feel in terms of this life that I've chosen. I've not become a farmer because I want to make money. You know, it's clearly not a profit-driven goal, right? But it is the most fulfilling work that I've ever imagined doing, and the most intellectually challenging work as well. Being a farmer is sort of the opposite, I would say, and to put a caveat on this, we're talking about being an eco-agriculture or regenerative farmer, right, diversified, we're talking about as opposed to monocropping system. But within that model, you know, you have to be a generalist. It's the opposite of being a specialist, and you have to have skills that cross so many disciplines and so many different you know, ways of thinking. I mean, you have to navigate entomology and soil science and, you know, agroecology and chemistry. You have to be a plant physiologist. You have to be a livestock. You have to be a veterinarian. You have to be a grazing specialist. You have to be a mechanic. You have to be a human resources manager. You have to be a business person. You have to do marketing. Farming has so much fulfillment intellectually involved in it as a profession, and this is something that's really hard for people to see because of the way society sets us up to view the world of agricultural production and devalue the intelligence of both farmers and farm laborers. And so I think we really need to change the way we think about just what goes into a decision to become part of the food system and the labor force, and that people are making rational decisions, and that it is a very fulfilling lifestyle, especially when done in a holistic manner.
So this is a conversation. I mean, there's so many farmers, like you, Suzanne, spoke to so eloquently. They do it for the love of the work, the love of the connection that they have, that they can share with other people, and they do deserve incredible respect for all that they bring and all the skills that they cultivate, whether it's, you know, hoeing carrots or, you know, dealing with a complicated sale. I mean, all of these things take incredible skill and patience and endurance. And I believe that farmers need to be compensated adequately for that. And David, at Vinland, you are sourcing locally, and to do that, it comes at a price, right? It makes the food more expensive. So I guess I wonder if you have any reflections on what some people would call food apartheid, right? And how there is really two different food systems in this country in many ways, and the ability to choose food that might be more ethical is not something that everyone can make. It's not a choice everyone has because of their needs. So I wondered if you could just speak to how you talk about that in your community, how you think about that, and maybe any ideas that you've seen locally in terms of bringing local food to more people.
Yeah, this is certainly a very fraught issue. Food should be more expensive. And that's a hard thing to say in a country where many people have very poor access to food. Many people have no savings. A great many people have negative net worth. People are struggling to find decent jobs. You know, we hear about what a strong economy we're in because Wall Street is doing well, because executives are doing well, but as I think everyone in this room knows very well, we live in an era of wealth polarization that we haven't seen since the 20s, and probably worse even than then. So it's one thing for me, a Dartmouth graduate, owner of a fine dining restaurant, to say, yeah, we should all be spending more on food. But as a gross generalization, we can say that Americans, as a body, are spending a smaller percentage of their total income on food than any other society on earth, and probably any other society in history. So even with the caveats, I will say Americans as a whole should be spending a whole lot more than 10 to 12% of their total income on food. That's just much too low. The big issue that we come up against is that industrial food is incredibly expensive. It's much, much, much more expensive than sustainably produced food. But most of those costs are externalized. With sustainable food, the costs are internalized. You're actually going to pay for them when you spend $6 or $7 or $8 a dozen on eggs, and when you spend $12 or $15 a pound on grass-fed beef. That's actually a pretty good reflection of the real cost of that food, and that food will nourish you. It will pay its benefits forward. When you look at industrial food, the costs are externalized, so you're paying 99 cents a dozen for your eggs. But the impact on the land is not being accounted for in those 99 cents. The impact on the local community, not having well-paid neighbors, friends who are able to reinvest their money with economic activity. We saw in the film, of course, that even a small dairy farm in New England generates between $1 and $1.5 million of annual economic activity. Much of it is local activity. A dollar that's reinvested in your local economy is much, much more valuable than a dollar that's shipped off to Amazon. So we have to be willing to spend more. That means spending less in other places. Well, one of the places where we're spending far, far, far too much, and where we're most likely to be ruined, is of course healthcare. So I think this is one of the places where we really need to look at our big picture public policy. Having lived in a few different European countries, it's just mind-boggling at this point that Americans pay out of pocket for healthcare that for a great many of us is essentially not usable unless we have a catastrophe. So if we were able to free up some of our income through, say, a much more efficient healthcare system without going completely off the deep end on that one issue, and also with limiting our wants, this is trouble, core trouble with capitalist society. We are being inundated with media to keep us ever hungry for more consumer goods. Of course, as Suzanne was saying, I don't think that's what we're truly hungry for, but the fact that we are truly hungry for real human connection makes us very susceptible to being seduced into thinking that we're actually just hungry for consumer goods. We can free up some more of that income so that maybe we do wind up spending 20 to 30% of our income on food. For the vast majority of Americans, that would allow us to eat really nutrient-dense, really ethically raised food, and still have the large bulk of our income for the rest of life, which would be considered pretty amazing by any world standard, by any historical standard. So I think that's a big part of it. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, so my last question, Michael, is for you. I noticed in your research on the Dominican Republic, you talk about the, is it the gilded cage? Is that right?
Gilded trap.
Trap. Does that apply in this situation?
Oh.
In this situation being U.S. agriculture, like broadly speaking.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. So I also wanted to just reflect on something was Liana said about farming. It reminded me, I don't think it's the exact same idea, but it reminded me honestly of a Freakonomics podcast episode I once heard, where basically it's called like In Praise of Maintenance, or the importance of maintenance. And the argument they made there was that, and just to further reflect on it, I feel like I've seen some of the same dynamics at Dartmouth. You know, we talked about the importance of innovation earlier, and I think that's true, but I do think there's this kind of over-glamorization, you know, where now creative is a noun, and where everyone kind of wants to be an entrepreneur, and we really undervalue just doing the things that are needed to keep things running, right? So in the last 8 or 9 years, I've, through personal experience, now appreciate, you know, what it takes to take care of other people, older and younger, right, than I used to. Of course, personal experience is frequently the best teacher there. Teaching all of these things that kind of like they need to get done in order to really make things go, and even within any particular job, right? Like once you have a job, yeah, on the outside it can sometimes look like, oh, you get to do this or that, but like ultimately you need to do your job. And a lot of that is simply like getting up, and you know, that's a lot of what was emphasized in the video, which I really liked. It's like, no, you have to like do these things. And if you want the parts and the teeny bits that look glamorous to other folks, like that's like the little iceberg at the top, and really most of it is like all of this kind of grunt work. And you need to kind of be able to find a way to enjoy that stuff, right? If you're going to be successful in those ways. So I just want to reflect on that, and that definitely. It's something I've thought about as an educator here. I mean, I saw in the environmental studies department, I do have students that'll come up to me and say, well, you know, I want to do this, I want to do that, I could also, you know, go work at, you know, for this consulting firm, etc. And so I see like these students really struggling with this, and I do think there's a lot of competing discourses and values about prestige and fulfillment and money that everyone's like still struggling with. But I do think we need to turn the discourse a bit more towards how do we maintain what we already have, in addition to thinking about how to create like the next app that's going to save the world, just to put it that way. So your question about gilded traps, I'm kind of piling on a political commentary now. Yeah, I mean, so there's this really, in my field, there's this language about kind of social and ecological traps. And the most well-known one historically is the poverty trap, which is basically reflecting this dynamic where that if you are impoverished, it can be difficult to get out of it without some kind of external force or some ability to kind of get over a hump, so that you don't have, basically you don't have the capital resources to get yourself what you need to get out of it. So it can be very self-reinforcing. And this idea of a gilded trap, I'll try not to stay very abstract here, is simply this idea that we can be trapped in lucrative systems as well. So in the Dominican Republic where I work, and I think this is pretty generalizable, the rice farming is very lucrative. But partly it's lucrative because the costs are externalized, right? So there's downstream pollution, and that's affecting the mangroves and the fishery systems where I also work. But the system becomes trapped in this kind of gilded cage because of how it's benefiting particular people in the system. But and I think it's helpful to think about this as also being a trap, because it's not just, because it's kind of more counterintuitive to think of that as a trap, right? Because it's like, well, there's certain people that are doing well, we're buying shiny new things, and we're able to make a lot of money. But ultimately, like, we're making a lot of money because we're externalizing a lot of the costs of what we're doing. And we're not measuring those things very well. Frequently, the costs of our activities are the most diffuse, lagged, and difficult to measure, so we don't measure them. And so it's just it's a reflection on the fact that, hey, things can be looking well, but ultimately the things that are going well for us now might actually lead to fairly predictably degradation in the future. So again, like in the Dominican Republic, things are going well there. It's a gilded trap because they're doing well because they're using more water they can really afford to use. Right, and again, like we see that in the aquifer, there's like many places where we're kind of mortgaging the future to do really well now. It was basically that idea. I want to kind of end on some other positive note than that. So, I mean, they are traps, but part of the language of traps too, so I'm going to try here, is that they're, it's important, I think, to identify the ways we can move out of these, like, I think folks have probably heard, a lot of folks have heard of Donella Meadows, who has a strong presence at Dartmouth historically, and one of my favorite works that Donella wrote was on these 12 leverage points for change, which I think is really an effective way to think about, we are stuck in these different traps, we're locked into these different ways of doing things, but we can talk systematically and rigorously about how we might leverage certain trigger points in the system to move out of it. And I do think we need to think about the different actors in the system from the top down and the bottom up and who can do what where. Okay, that's staying quite abstract, but I don't want to go on too far. There is helpful language also, I think, from people like Donella Meadows and others to think about how we kind of get out of some of these traps as well. Leverage points for changes in the system, something like that. I've assigned it to some of my students. You can probably ask them.
All right. Did any of the panelists want to respond to that, and then we can go on to audience questions? Audience questions?
Well, before we do that, there were just a couple of things that people said that I wanted to just take a
Yes.
little footnotes on.
Yes, of course.
I'm
going to give you the mic.
There's a terrific book when Suzanne was talking about her cows, her relationship with her animals, and especially cows, and not wanting to disappoint her animals and paying attention to them. I thought of the book The Secret Life of Cows by Rosamund Young, rather. And that's a wonderful book. If any of you haven't read it, it's really short, and her brother is Richard Young, who works at the Sustainable Food Trust, and they're just a wonderful family in the UK that writes and speaks in wonderful ways about sustainable food production and animals, and I recommend that book. Also, I just wanted to note on how much we pay for food. In 1950, Americans paid 31% of their income for food. So the fact that we pay 9% now is something of an anomaly, and really, we get what we pay for. And Michael Pollan says, he always puts things in such beautiful little sound bites. He says, you pay your grocer now or you pay your doctor later. And so I really like this idea of connecting the quality of the food that we're putting in our bodies in our lifetimes to our health. And especially over the long term, it's much harder to see that, but I think that's becoming very clear as we have this massive population-wide health problem now that's really challenging, literally bankrupting our healthcare system and is causing all others, our quality of life is just suffering as a nation because of this. So those were just a few additional little thoughts that I wanted to add to it.
Thank you, Nicolette and David, for mentioning nutrients and nutrient density. I just wanted to add another little thought on top of that, which is that I think maybe Nico mentioned yesterday that the USDA has measured for about a century the nutrient content in fruits and vegetables being produced in this country, and just recently stopped making those measurements, but saw over the past, I wonder why, 100 years or so, drastic declines in nutrient content in fruits and vegetables across the board, even up to 75% decline. So when we say, you heard the apple a day, right, it's 6 apples a day now to get the same nutrient content. So when we talk about buying nutrient-dense food as consumers, unfortunately there isn't a whole lot available. And that has to do with, of course, the ubiquitous production methods that rely on fossil fuel-based petrochemical fertilizers and NPK-based, without any of the other minerals and nutrients that plants need, and the dead biodiversity and soil microbial populations that no longer can have the appropriate relationships with the plants that they need to have in order to be sort of sustaining and supporting, facilitating the kind of uptake of nutrients that plants need to have from the soil, even if the soil does contain those nutrients. So because our soils across the country are mostly dead, the production methods have to incorporate remineralization and essentially reviving the biological life in the soil if we're going to be producing nutrient-dense food for people to consume. So we have to go back to production a little bit, because even if people were able to afford, even if food apartheid didn't exist the way it does, there still isn't the supply of nutrient-dense foods available that we need. And hopefully at some point, I know there's some really interesting work being done by different organizations, one called the Bionutrient Food Association in Massachusetts, to try and empower consumers to be able to understand what nutrient density really means and use it as a measure of quality. Because right now, what are the measures of quality in our food system? Appearance, shelf stability, uniformity, shippability, whatever, is most convenient for the industry, high quality. But really it doesn't have anything to do with the health beneficial properties or the nutrients giving content of the food that we're going to consume. So when we were able as consumers to identify, and this is what they're trying to develop, is this spectrometer that will take light readings of the actual contents, minerals, phytonutrients, antioxidants, essential oils, all the contents of the fruits and vegetables. If you could point and shoot that from your little device, for example, in the grocery store at that peach and at that cucumber and say, that has good nutrients in it, that doesn't. If consumers were empowered that way, the whole production chain would change. But right now, what we're looking at is a dearth of nutrient-dense food, just in terms of what's available, even to those who are privileged enough to be able to shop at Whole Foods or the Co-op.
All right, audience, you must have a few questions. All right, I guess I'll start with the front row.
Thanks. It's more of an amplification, I think, than a question. Because I like the way that you move the conversation from kind of the supermarket to questions of food apartheid and so forth. Because I don't think that the ethical answer to ethical questions consists in the supermarket, right? Or even in the restaurant necessarily. And I want to see if I can say this by way of an example. And that's in 2003 when I was the head of the geography department at Syracuse University. I got a phone call from Dale Jamieson, who ran the Samaritan Center hot food site in town, saying that he thought the geography of poverty in the city of Syracuse had really shifted, that the geography of service had not. And could we help him figure that out? I had no idea what he was talking about, but I said yes. I got our GIS person involved. And we developed the Syracuse Hunger Project, which did a lot of things, but one of the things it did is it mapped food pantries with opening hours and so forth, and saw that he was right, the geography had switched. But what we found is if we wanted people to be able to get food, a few things had to happen. One is we had to figure out the succession plans for church-based food pantries. The volunteers were in their 80s, largely, right? There was no one behind them. Right? So an ethical consumption would be figuring out that emergency food system, right? An ethical consumption for us would be figuring that out. The second thing that we figured out is if we really wanted to eat ethically, we'd have to break the power of the Food Bank of Central New York and its beholdenness to neoliberal ideas of best practices. Because that kept a lot of people out of the emergency food system. We had different ideas about how this should work, different ideas of accountability, different sets of ethics. But most importantly, one of the things we did is we mapped a day in the life of me. It was a very complex day that I had. I had to get my in-laws to the airport. I had to go do a whole bunch of stuff. I had to go hiking in the woods. I had to do all kinds of things, right? And a friend, Tanya, is a single mother of 4 who is on welfare. She had a few months remaining of her lifetime eligibility, 2-year-old at home. The father had walked out, and a 16-year-old and a couple in between. And we mapped what we were able to do during those days. I could do anything. I could go anywhere. I drove past supermarkets all the time. I could go to the CSA I belonged to, all those sorts of things. She had to go to her son's high school to fill out a piece of paper, which is a 1-hour bus trip in each direction, which made her then actually in violation of her welfare rules. So if we wanted ethical eating, we had to fight politically, right, to transform, which we've of course not been successful in, the racist, misogynist ways that welfare operates. But not only that, she could not send her son outside to go to the corner store because this was an area that was run by gangs that he was not a member of. He could not go out after school, basically. There was a Burger King across the street. She could get food at Burger King. Right, on her way home, because it was close, she could still be able to carry what she needed for her family and her 2-year-old in her arm, right? And this is what her life was. So if we wanted to eat ethically, we had to fight politically to transform those sorts of issues. And I think that's one of the crucial things, that a lot of the times we turn around these ethical questions about our own self-behavior, which is important, and I think everything that everyone said has been really important. But just as often, we have to think politically about what has to be transformed in our urban and our rural landscapes, our social landscapes, as well as our physical landscapes, so that others may eat. Full stop.
Okay, so I guess, do any of you have reflections on how we should be interacting with government and in politics around building an ethical food system? Volunteers?
I don't know if any of you have been following Tim Ryan's presidential bid. It's super interesting. I never even heard of him. But he's one of the 25 people that we announced. And I believe he's a congressman from Ohio right now, but I've watched a few of his videos. He's the only presidential candidate that's talking about the food system. So I'm not saying people should support him. But it was fascinating to me because all of a sudden, the issue is out there for the first time. And when I did in the presidential discussion, the presidential campaign trail, and I've done volunteer lobbying several times on Capitol Hill for things like antibiotics overuse in the food industry. And every single meeting I had with staff or congresspeople, we were told, I love what you're saying, I agree with every word you said, but I'm not hearing about this from my constituents. So I really think just the elevation of this issue beyond personal food choices to a political discussion is so important, and we need to make sure that whenever we engage with the political system, we're raising these issues of food. And it's super interesting because Tim Ryan is basing his whole, I don't think he has a prayer about the Democratic nomination, but the fact that he's out there talking about this is quite extraordinary. And I think we just need to keep saying, this is important, this matters. This matters to us individually, this matters to our healthcare system, this matters to our landscapes, this matters to our children. I mean, it's so obvious to those of us that are working on it, and yet it is not really in the political dialogue very much. So I think there are lots of, ways to try to keep making sure it's getting into our political discourse. Maybe else we
Maybe in addition to demanding full disclosure of our elected officials' financial statements, they need to tell us what's in their fridge.
Just as an academic, and there's not probably all that many other folks in academia here today, which is actually it's nice to talk to a range of folks.
Well, I have a high school diploma,
No, I think it is important. I went to a talk once where some senior colleague got up and basically said we should not think about our field as only being involved in knowledge production the way we normally think about it. We actually should feel compelled to engage with the world as we're doing our work. We should want to develop knowledge collaboratively with local partners. There's a whole participant-based, participatory research is now a thing in several fields. So within academia, I think there needs to be more engagement, and we need to have more of these discourses. So like projects like that, it's great to hear about. It is like an active topic. You won't get universal agreement about this. I mean, some people will feel kind of affronted if you ask them to go beyond producing basic knowledge. But I think it's at least a talk that needs to be had. You're not necessarily telling everyone they need to be scholar activists, but to be engaged with non-academic folks. Non-academic is a funny term. So I mean, that's partly I was really pumped to hear, when Matt first mentioned this project in this meeting. It was a great example of getting people from different groups together. So I think within academia, there needs to be more of a push to move out and engage with folks as we're producing knowledge, for sure.
I just wanted to speak briefly to this as well from a different angle. I mentioned before, of course, the matter of identifying with the land, having a culture of place, and in terms of engaging with the government and working to affect policy change, I think there are ways in which we have a false divide between right and left in this country. and there are ways in which we get overly hung up on the divide between right and left, whether it's a real divide or more often kind of a mock one because everyone's neoliberal in official circles. I think one way that we can reach across the aisle, so to speak, is to frame it in terms of patriotism. Because when you look at how public money is spent in this country on subsidizing food, you compare that to certain other countries, the differences are very stark. I can go into the Shaw's supermarket in my hometown of Bath, Maine, and buy really terrific quality grass-fed Gruyere from Switzerland for less money than I have to spend buying directly from a farmer a comparably good cheese made within 10 miles of my home. And there are perhaps multiple reasons for that, but one very important reason is that Switzerland subsidizes its dairy farmers up to 90%. In America, we don't subsidize organic farmers. We don't subsidize artisan food producers. We subsidize big agro producing industrial corn and soy. And as a consequence, we have a country where over a quarter of people are diabetic. We have these spiraling healthcare costs, getting back to that issue again, that are a direct consequence of our public policy where our subsidy dollars are going. Why do the Swiss spend their public money on supporting the folks who are creating Gruyere, the farmers on their land that by any normal standard would be considered pretty marginal land for agriculture? Well, it's because they're very patriotic. And for them, I mean, they like their flag as much as anyone, but their patriotism goes far beyond the flag. You know, it goes to cheese. That's what they really care about. That's where their cultural identity really lies. And the idea that they would stop producing Emmentaler and Appenzeller and Gruyere because they should all be making their zillions in Geneva as bankers, it's unthinkable to them as Swiss. And so they band together and they force their government to keep Swiss farming alive. Well, we really need to work on the level of culture to identify as Americans with the land and with each other, enough to say, well, our patriotism isn't something so shallow as, you know, caring about the flag and that's it. You know, it's got to be about the food, it's got to be about the land, it's got to be about the people who are producing it. And then, and I suspect really only then, will people in large numbers start lobbying their Congress people so that they'll be like, oh God, I really am hearing from my constituents now.
All right, I'm gonna go to this side. Just the first. All right, this is so hard. Gosh. All right, question, please.
Okay, question. I'm Grace Gershuni. I'm from Vermont, the other side of the river. And there's so many things that each of you have said that resonated with me. There were some things that I didn't hear until maybe some of the questions that started coming up. And, you know, my whole adult life I've been talking about all the same things that you guys have been talking about here. And the things I didn't hear were more about the politics until just now, more about the inherent impossibility of solving the problems of the food system without taking on the political and economic system that we're all swimming in and naming it, which is capitalism. And the foundation of capitalism in racism. And the fact that every time I go to a conference about agriculture, there's maybe, 0 to 5 people of color present. And the foundations of the injustice of the food system and the whole foundation of it, how we even, that the foundation of capitalism was on slavery and food and cotton and sugar. And the foundations of our poor health are on, sugar and carbohydrates and the carbohydrate and the hydrocarbon economy. So this isn't really a question, this is a...
I'll turn it into a question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about justice and racial equity when it comes to the food system. How should this play out into the ethics of consumption, the ethics of food policy, the ethics of production? How do you all think about that in your work?
Thank you so much for bringing that question up. In my very first lecture that I have with my students, I talk about how the foundation of our food system is based in slavery, exactly, and in that kind of, in the whole exploitative nature, the way that humans throughout this entire country's agricultural history, since the history of industrialization, let's remember that 20,000 years of stewardship by Native Americans before that happened existed in a very sort of harmonious manner, the relationship with nature, that this exploitative system has been the foundational element, right? And that we're not going to fix the food system, as you said, without fixing racism, nor without fixing classism. And so we're fortunate, I think, to have the opportunity to talk about this in a multidisciplinary way, where we can think about looking at the avenues, the opportunities for making change as multitudinous, right? I always try to steer my students in the direction of seeing, okay, I know it's really horrifying, it's overwhelming, it's unethical, it's terrible, I would so much rather just decide to be a vegan and say I've absolved myself of responsibility, but it doesn't work that way. And we also have tremendous opportunity, no matter what direction we're coming at it from. The point mostly, in my mind, is that we need to make it visible. The food system has been designed to be invisible. That's convenient for the industry. It works very well that way. And Michael Pollan had a conversation with Barack Obama. You may remember having read an article he wrote probably 8 years ago now, about that conversation where Obama said, "Show me the movement," and it just wasn't obvious that there is enough of a voice of people rallying around this issue. And it really is because the industry and big ag would rather we don't see what's going on. So as long as we can, and many of us, I think, have the opportunity to just share this information, make it visible, and recognize that we need to pay attention to where those erasures in the story, the value of individual contributions, particularly people of color, particularly people of indigenous origin, have been erased from the story of good food, is really, really important. And we just need to make it more visible in every way we can.
Thank you. Okay. Nico, do you have a question? I'm gonna start to be tougher, so you got a real question.
Yeah, I wanted to expand on that a little bit because first question. What I didn't hear quite from Liana here, and which was brought up by Grace so wonderfully, is the catalyst connection. And I would like to hear from maybe one or two or all of you how is the vision, what is your vision going forward of an ethical food system? Yesterday we sort of touched a little bit on that it might not be possible to have sustainable, regenerative, and maybe in light of what we've learned today, ethical agriculture in conjunction with capitalism. They might just not be compatible. Now, Nicolette, I'm going to pick on you a little bit here because as an owning class background farmer who's practicing a lot of these things, you and your husband have sold your business to a multi-billion corporation, you're part of the board, you have the influence to actually get into, and the insight, to be in the nitty-gritty part of this capitalist connection to food. What is the vision the ethical vision that comes out of Nyman's Ranch connection with Blue Apron and, you know, sort of for the larger food system and where we're going in the future with that.
Okay, run back down here. Single mic situation. All right, Nicolette, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, just clarification, my husband, Bill Nyman, is the founder of Nyman Ranch, and he left. He did not sell it. He left voluntarily with nothing. The business he'd spent 30 years building up, so that's an important distinction. I think both Bill and I feel that, first of all, that no solution is viable unless it makes the living of farming sustainable for the farmers. And we believe that having a good and fair compensation to the farmer is essential. I mean, that was the founding value of, actually Rebecca Burgess is in the room. She and I were on a panel a while back ago in California talking about the founding of our different entities that we work for, and I talked a lot about how Nyman Ranch was founded. And really the principle of it from the beginning was it was really a network of farmers and ranchers and trying to make sure that they received a fair price for their production. And what was so interesting and unique about the Nyman Ranch model at its founding was that it was all about making sure that the farmer was protected from the vagaries of the marketplace. So there was a floor and a ceiling. And the ceiling was sometimes something people didn't like that much. But the floor saved literally hundreds of farmers in the upper Midwest, because when pork fell to 8 cents a pound, they were getting over $1 a pound. And literally their farms were saved because of that. And I had a lot of farmers tell me that. So I think there are models like that out there. To me, this whole notion of cooperation, it's also been mentioned today a couple of times, people coming together, the Lentil Underground book that Liz Carlisle wrote and so forth. This notion of people coming together and saying, okay, we're all creating something that's similar. What are the ways that we can get things, especially with animals, it's so important to be able to get the animals to a slaughterhouse. It's very difficult to get a slaughterhouse to accept your pigs for slaughter if you just have 3 or 4, but if you have a truckload full, then you can get them in, etc. So I think this notion of people cooperating more, individual farmers creating cooperatives, not necessarily a co-op, but cooperative networks and entities, I think is essential. I don't really have a specific opinion about capitalism and whether it should continue or not. I mean, obviously I have thoughts about it, but I don't feel qualified to make a statement about that. But I really do think that people creating viable businesses is a key part of this. I don't really view the government as providing the answers, but I think they're an important player. But I just think more cooperation between individual farmers. We recreated, after my husband left Nyman Ranch, we recreated another entity, which was BN Ranch, which was purchased by Blue Apron, but again, we didn't get rich on that either, and he left that as well. So, because that's just what my husband does, because as soon as something starts getting watered down, he doesn't like it anymore, and I really appreciate that, so, and I'm with him. So we're not part of the Blue Apron entity anymore either, but in any event,
So that's the ethics, right? I mean,
yeah, I mean, that's
sort of
the
core
rub,
I wanted to
right,
tease out.
exactly. Because as soon as you get into a bigger organization, the ethics want to be watered down. There's no question about that. But I think maybe the solution is keeping it small but not tiny.
Mhm.
I don't know, it looks like, I think some other people wanted to say something else.
It's too much to ask for me to come up with a political solution to anything, given what I'm occupied with all day long. So I think it doesn't necessarily follow that even a really savvy, politically aware farmer farms and politicizes. I think maybe that's somebody else's job. And given the fact that all this political rigmarole that goes around every year, every 4 years, doesn't seem to be improving anything as far as I can tell. as I said when I was with a bunch of the students from the mountain school today, sometimes you just have to decide, can I mitigate what wrongs are in power, or is it better just to go ahead and do something do it really well? And there's no doubt in my mind that my energies are best used paying attention to the land, paying attention to the animals, stewarding, and I better hand the microphone off before I start swearing. But there's nothing positive that I can think of that deserves my energy more than doing an honorable job on the land and providing an example for young people to imagine that you can have a beautiful, productive life on the land. Because if they don't see it, they're not going to be able to imagine it. And if they don't imagine it, it's not going to happen.
So yeah, definitely building on actually the last several comments. I mean, I think, again, it's important I think we can sometimes get stuck in thinking, well, we need change like in Washington, D.C., or it's like that or bust. And I do think we need to think about, how do we sustain ourselves over time? And when I've been involved in, say, experiential education with students, a lot of the value for that to me is that we go places and we see people doing things in certain landscapes, and we see the progress that's being made in particular times and places. And I think that's really important to remember that's how change is going to happen for the most part anyway. And if we wait for things to happen globally before things can happen locally, we're going to wait a long time. And just building on that and thinking of how you build change from the bottom up. I mean, obviously I was talking about cooperation in the comments, and you mentioned cooperation. I mean, one of the things that we see empirically is that cooperation is difficult within a group. It's more difficult across groups and across difference. I mean, there are unique challenges that are built in there, right? So, and I think it's something for us all to take seriously because, right, so I can say that I don't like capitalism and someone else can say they don't, and so we know that we both don't like capitalism, we agree. But it's easier for us to agree on that than it is to engage with someone who comes to us and says, well, actually, maybe I think capitalism is okay. And so we should be willing to engage with that person. As much as it helps, it makes me feel like, oh, I don't like capitalism, this other person doesn't. I still, a big part of our social challenge is to engage across differences of ideas and all kinds of differences. To say, okay, but how do we actually move forward in maybe a landscape that we both live in, right? And I think that's, that is the challenge of scaling up governance and change, is how do you work together within a group, and then once you've got your cohesion within your group, you're going to need to work with other groups. And that's frequently more difficult. So thinking about that is how your cohesion actually affects how you engage with outgroups and other folks. Is something I want you to think about, even as we're kind of forming a group here, right? That's something to think about.
So I wanted to address Nico's question by saying that, from my perspective, capitalism is absolutely the problem. Not the only problem, but I think capitalism. I mean, what is capitalism exactly? I mean, one could say, from a certain classical perspective, it's based on the liberal writings of David Ricardo and Adam Smith and what have you, but that was pre-industrial, or the very dawning of the industrial era, and was the Western market economy not operating on capitalist modes prior to that? I mean, I think it's definitely hard to pin down what exactly is capitalism, but to me, it's basically the purest manifestation of the economic side of a civilized society, and civilization sort of in an etymologically proper sense of based on cities, based on having extractive agriculture, having concentrations of people living in place that are too large to be sustainable in place. They require the constant importation of resources. I'm leaning on Derek Jensen with this definition. And so I think that when you have a capitalist economy, it comes part and parcel with an objectifying ontology. You know, that when you begin to allow for the possibility that the world is not what Thomas Berry would call a communion of subjects, but a collection of objects, and you say, well, I own this land, not I am of this land, or this land owns me. And you say, I'm going to do with it whatever I damn well please. I'm going to extract as much value, use value for me from these others. Well, you have to deny them spirit, otherwise you're just a terrible person, right? So if you can say this is an object, not a subject, it has no spirit, it has only use value unto me, you do what you wish, you exploit them to the utmost. So I think you have this key relationship in capitalism and more broadly in that civilized ontology between exploitation and alienation. You are alienating yourself from the spirit of the other, whether the other is a human being or a plant or an animal or anything that comprises this world. You alienate yourself so that you can exploit, so that you can say this is a resource, this is an object, and then you get capitalism. So are we going to take down capitalism through a great socialist revolution? I don't see that happening in this country for a number of reasons. I do think it's really important to be pragmatic and to say, what can I achieve in the context of capitalism? Where are some ways that we can modify the worst excesses of capitalism, but how can we also look ahead again to the collapse of industrial capitalism and create enough lifeboats where we can that we continue to exist and hopefully thrive as a species. But as we move into that post-collapse society, if in fact we manage to get there, that we reassert what was the common currency, I say, pun intended, of indigenous peoples in their ontology, which is animism. The understanding that there is spirit everywhere, and it's all connected. And an affront to any part of it is an affront to our very own nature. And that what goes around comes around. So I think we have to plant those seeds in every way we can.
All right, well, we are out of time. Can we give a round of applause to our incredible